and welcome to the International Center for Journalists Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum and our special event uncovering climate change in 2021. My name is Jennifer Dora. I'm a senior program director at ICFJ. I'm also a journalist who is passionate about climate change coverage, so I'm excited to bring together a really incredible panel of reporters and editors for you today. They're exploring new and untold aspects of the climate change story, which I think is one of the most important that can be covered right now. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Imelda V. Abano has covered climate change, biodiversity, and other environment-related issues for nearly 2 decades. She's the founder and president of the Philippine Network of Environmental Journalists. As a Philippines and Pacific Region coordinator for Internews's Earth Journalism Network, she has helped train more than 5,000 journalists across the world. Presently, she is the contributing editor of Manga Bay Philippines and the editor of the Philippine Enviro News. David Callaway is an innovative global editor and media executive who, as editor-in-chief of USA Today, transitioned the newspaper into the 4th largest digital news group in the United States. He helped build early internet news pioneer CBS Market Watch as its top editor, and later he managed the turnaround and sale of The Street as its CEO. And this year, he founded Callaway Climate Insights, which explores the intersection of climate and finance in a daily newsletter, which he edits. We are also lucky to count him as a member of ICFJ's board of directors. And Gustavo Faleros, a journalist and media trainer who specializes in data-driven journalism, joins us as well. He is also a news innovator and a former ICFJ Knight Fellow, a fellow for life. As we like to say, you're once a Knight Fellow, always one. So that's a special part of ICFJ. In 2012, he launched Info Amazonia, a digital map that uses satellite and other publicly available data to monitor the Amazon rainforest, which he's been expanding that model and expanding Info Amazonia ever since, and inspiring news startups in other countries to use the model and the code to build their own platforms to cover environmental issues like the health of the Nile River in Egypt and wildlife poaching in South Africa. He's also helped build training networks, which have prepared journalists to report on the ground about the state of the forests and the environment in their communities. And most recently, he joined the Pulitzer Center as its first environmental investigations editor. A quick reminder to the people tuning in, if you have questions during our discussion, please post them on the Zoom chat or in the comments of the Facebook live stream if you're joining us there. Thank you all for joining us today. We're really thrilled to have all of you here. I'd like to start by asking each of you to talk about climate change issues in your country or in your region. What are the biggest stories you and other journalists are covering now that are related to climate change, and how are you tackling those, and how's your news outlet tackling them? Imelda, let's start with you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Good morning, everyone, at least from my part of the world, and good evening. Most of you have probably seen the devastating impact of strong typhoons in the Philippines for the past few years, as shown in these slides, and the 3 strong typhoons in just 3 weeks, where most parts of the country were flooded. Here in my hometown in the Philippines, as shown in this slide, this was taken early this week after a strong typhoon. There's flooding all over. Here is another part of the Philippines last week. Next slide. Also flooded due to another typhoon. And a week before that was another typhoon. So an average of 20 typhoons a year passes through the country. For a country literally at the doorstep of typhoons and natural disasters like this, the Philippines, a low-lying archipelago of more than 1 million people, is a perfect laboratory of stories to humanize the impact of climate change. And I think that also goes with most countries in Asia and the Pacific region. With the country's vulnerability, the media is now slowly paying attention to reporting climate change and its related issues. So some still struggle to place climate-related stories until after extreme weather events such as this. But as mentioned, we are seeing a fundamental shift in newsworthiness of climate change. Well, of course, as you know, as a news subject, it is deemed complex, as we know. It requires a basic understanding of science and its technical aspect would relate to a larger concerns of the society. While we do not attribute every disaster to climate change per se, scientists say monsoon rains are being intensified by rising sea surface temperatures. So this is how we cover, the media covers climate change in the Philippines. It's an intersection of climate change and disasters.
Gustavo, I wanted to ask you next if you could talk about the situation in Brazil, and we also would like to hear about your new Pulitzer Center gig.
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, ICFJ, for this invitation. Good evening, everyone. I'm speaking from São Paulo, Brazil, and here is 9 p.m., but it's a great pleasure being here with you, third place. I have to say that since last year, or since the past year, again, the Amazon region, which is my primary focus area where I'm doing my work, has become a really global story. And in a sense, it's very interesting to see how this issues of deforestation are now clearly related with climate change. So turning this story into a global story. And so since last year, because of the great event of forest fires we had in the Amazon, we saw an interesting aspect, an interesting trend in the media of doing exactly what I said, to relate deforestation and the problems of the Amazon with the global climate. And so this is the narrative going on now, and the story is pretty much in a higher sphere, which I mean, like it's involved with, for example, with the trade agreement between the Mercosur and European Union, or mentioned during the American elections, so the politics of Brazil is pretty much responding as well to this kind of a worldwide discussion about the future of the Amazon. So the story that journalists are trying to cover here is both domestically, trying to show the impacts of this global diplomacy on the domestic politics, and also looking at the global level on the possible problems that Brazil might face on, for example, international markets, or even now international politics. I want to remember again that the new elected president of the US, Joe Biden, has mentioned the Amazon region as one of the primary areas he wants to focus and discuss on the climate change. So I think the story is already there, like the main story right now, the climate story, in my opinion, it's related to this recent events. And I think already talking a little bit about this new role at the Pulitzer Center, I think the story is becoming much more complex, in a sense that we'll need journalists, in-depth journalists, to understand the complexities, that what are the real drivers of deforestation and how this, again, linked to climate change. And that's what we're trying to do with this rainforest investigative network, investigations network that the Pulitzer Center just launched, and I'm having the honor of coordinate. There's going to be a cohort of 10 journalists, investigative journalists, working for a year with fellowships to try to uncover some issues of like human rights abuse, climate change again, or corruption and governance involving in the 3 main tropical rainforest regions of the planet, the Amazon, Congo, and Southeast Asia. So I'm excited to be working with that. Thank you.
Thank you. That sounds really important and a good, it's deepening and continuing the work you've been doing, which is fantastic.
Thanks, Jennifer.
So Dave, could you tell us about Callaway Climate Insights? You have very deep experience as a journalist, as an editor, and in business also, but covering business has been your beat. And I'm wondering why, how it was that you decided climate change is the business story that you're going to devote your time to.
Well, sure, Jennifer. And hello, everybody from just outside San Francisco. And thank you again to ICFJ for throwing this panel for our readers and for everybody. I think the biggest story, to get to your first question, right now in the US is obviously the Biden transition. We've had 4 years of a US president who not only hasn't helped with the climate change battle for solutions, but who has actively hindered it, who has promoted the fossil fuel companies, who has set back regulations put in by his predecessor, Obama, to help us move towards a clean energy future. And so what Biden's opportunity is in the next couple of years, how he can work with Congress or not to enable solutions in the US, how he will work with other leaders of the world, the free world in Europe. The Amazon, obviously a huge story for anybody that cares about climate change. The stuff that's happening there is impacting all of us. We've seen this terrible storm, largest hurricane of the year in this area of the world, hit in Nicaragua and Honduras this past week. Those people in those countries have done absolutely nothing to cause the greenhouse gas emissions that are leading to climate change, and they're being wiped out. It certainly is a global story. But in the US, it's that transition. And then to get to your latter point, Jennifer, there's a lot that's been happening in the US and in world financial centers in the last couple of years. A massive wall of money, literally trillions of dollars, is being raised and started to be deployed towards climate solutions as the world becomes more familiar with them. In some areas, like in the Philippines and the Amazon, it's been a long-standing problem. In other places, like in the US, because of our political situation, not many people are really that educated on it. Anyway, this massive wall of money, trillions of dollars, is being raised and deployed by essentially banks and asset managers and governments in the form of subsidies. And they're looking for solutions. And there are a lot of entrepreneurs out there who are doing fascinating things to clean up plastics in the ocean and remove carbon from the soil and remove carbon from the air, to combat against sea rises, destroying some of our coastal cities. And so my reasoning for starting Callaway Climate Insights really was, I've seen this disconnect between this great journalism that's being done on the environmental side and lack of education and on the financial side, and a disconnect between the money that's being raised and the entrepreneurs who need it to create solutions. So I think climate change journalism, environmental journalism has been around forever. Some of the greatest journalists in the world are doing it, but climate change journalism in the mainstream media, particularly in the business press, is relatively early stage. And there's a lot of opportunities. A lot of young journalists want to get into that side of the business. And I thought it would be good to spend the next several years of my life and my career kind of on this story, which I think once we conquer COVID, will become the main story for decades to come. And I believe that the top new journalists to come on board globally are going to be focused on environmental and climate journalism.
Wow, that's great. Thank you. Gustavo, I saw you nodding about when Dave was talking about the business aspects and how it's not covered enough. And I know you also started your career at a business publication in Brazil. So I was wondering kind of what you see.
No, it's totally. Well, maybe I'm biased, but I'm totally agreeing with Dave. It's like I do think it's he does that. This is the story of the century. It's just because it touches everything. It's the final, transversal challenge that we have. Like it's everywhere. It's kind of it's literally a big story in a sense that it's huge scale, temporally, and it needs to be covered over years and in a vast geographical scope as well. So in that sense, I agree a lot. But on the financial aspect of journalism, and I have to say two things. First, I start to love environmental journalists working for a financial newspaper. It was there that I realized that this is wow, this is a super story, you know, like banks creating ways of dealing with climate change. Of course, the financial sector, not the financial journalist, has envisioned the problems of climate change much earlier because they are taking all the precautions, right? Like the insurance companies and things, they know what's happening very well. And so at that moment, beginning of the 2000s, I saw these guys preparing for something big. And that's how I learned a lot of, like, you know, discussion about energy and sanitation and water. It was really a big learning working for a financial newspaper. But on the other hand, I also learned that if there's one kind of journalist that is very partisan and takes a side, is the financial journalists, because they're pro-economic growth. They don't question if it's growing with fossil fuels. At that point, they didn't. That's why I agree also with David, that's in early stages. It would, just now they were saying like, well, there's a new hydroelectric power plant. Maybe there is some issues that we should consider that are not so good as building a new hydroelectric power plant, in a sense that they were supporting any kind of investment without questioning the environmental impacts. And so I think the financial journalism, it's the way of, I think, dealing with the issue with a much more mature way. So if the financial journalist improves the coverage of climate, I agree, the overall communications of the problem is going to be much better. That's my point.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Gustavo. And you know, the pursuit of growth has been the basis for financial companies, you know, forever. And they're the ones that have essentially invested and supported the fossil fuel companies through the decades of causing climate damage. You know, I think a lot of the disconnect that we've seen in the recent years with denial of climate change and movement, people, you know, saying that it's not going to impact them, is people really not understanding what's going on, or people treating it, when they're told that they're going to have to, you know, not eat meat or move, you know, to a different part of the country, treating it as a punishment. Now, I think with a lot of the money coming in, the search for climate change solutions is going to soon become an opportunity for lots of people, for investors, for large financial companies and stuff, beyond the insurance companies. And when it becomes an opportunity, you can get your growth and save the world at the same time, you know, with some of these bigger solutions that we're talking about. So that's why, you know, I think governments, it's going to be difficult for governments to mandate cleaning up the world and saving the world. They're going to need help, and creating financial markets and financial incentives for investing in climate solutions can only be part of that help.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah.
So as you've been ramping up with the newsletter and the site, it occurs to me, what are some of your kind of, how did you prepare to really cover this issue from a business perspective? And because I'm thinking about how people who are covering this issue for the first time, like a reporter who's new to it, how can they make sure that they're bringing the business, that they're investigating it properly?
Well, there's all sorts of, you know, the first thing you learn is that the learning curve is huge, very steep, and that climate change, environmental coverage, you know, entire news organizations are devoted to it. There could be dozens of beats, you know, from agricultural to ocean tech to policy to just financial. And so, you know, I think as a reporter, as a journalist covering it, you kind of need to choose your areas. Otherwise, you can just drown in the really the global size of the problem. And so my area I chose to focus on was the environmental, social, and governance area, the so-called ESG area, where a lot of that money is being raised. You know, that really is in its infancy and is just marred by lack of good information, lack of good data and metrics, and frankly, sensationalistic marketing that is going to end up hurting folks who are probably, you know, feeling like they want to put their money towards some good use. So there's a lot kind of just in that bucket which I've been focused on. But because of my connection with ICFJ and some of my other jobs in the past, I'm privileged to have a lot of friends in international journalism around the world. And so they're working with me on various other capacities, such as policy in Europe, policy in Asia, and kind of some of the things that can wrap into making it more of a global story. And so one of the things we're trying to do on the newsletter is synthesize all of the information that's happening every day down to the dozen or 2 dozen really interesting need to know stories from somebody kind of at the international level.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks. I was going to ask, you guys have touched on this a little bit already, but I wanted to ask sort of globally and also where you are, how would you characterize the state of climate change reporting? Is there enough of it? Is there enough high quality reporting? And do you think the reporting is reaching the people who need it? Melda, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Well, we have to admit that stories have had to compete with political and sensational crime and corruption stories that take top news priority. That is true not just in the Philippines or in Asia and the Pacific, but elsewhere, even in Brazil and the US. So we have to find ways to make climate change sexy and bring down the science to a level that can be easily explained on television or radio using local language. While reports, I think, increase significantly only when there are disasters such as in the Philippines, I would not say that there is a poor coverage, although environmental advocates would probably look forward to a time when climate change becomes a regular fare in our newspapers or broadcast news, the way there are regular sections for sports or even show business. But then over the years, I think media reports have started to put more focus on government policies in terms of management or funding for agencies at the forefront of climate change or disaster management. They are starting to read research reports based on available materials and sources. And I think discussing this issue in the media is an educational process as well. And of course, the training that most journalists received in strengthening their climate change reporting is a big boost for them to increase the quality and quantity of their reporting.
If I could just jump in, I think that's a great point, Amel. The discussion of it in the media, like these types of webinars, really it will help it become more mainstream in the media.
Right.
It is, it's like I said, environmental reporting has been around for a long time. Some of the greatest journalists in the world have done it and are doing it. But as it becomes more mainstream, as the public and the world begins to start to realize what's at stake, be educated at that, you're going to see more and more media, more and more journalists want to do that type of coverage, and more news companies, little newsletters like mine or big news companies like the Washington Post or the Guardian, dedicate significant resources to doing it. And that can only help. Part of the problem with climate change is it's always been billed as something that's gonna happen in the future. And so people understand that, but they've got more urgent priorities. And we saw with the way COVID came and took over the world in literally 2 weeks this past spring, that when your very lives are threatened, people start to pay attention. Climate journalists, in my opinion, have not been able to convey that threat in quite the same way as COVID conveyed it. And that is starting to change. And the more media coverage we get on it, the more people will start to realize what a threat it is, what an immigration story it is, what a poison story it is, what a pollution story it is.
I'm also agreeing with this point of view that it's a good moment. It's maybe a turning point in climate reporting. it definitely has evolved a lot, but I think the COVID itself, it will present a turning point in many things, but I think on the realization for journalists that science is really an area to focus, in a sense that journalists are preparing themselves to cover COVID because they have to, like read papers and articles, and never so many scientific articles were published in such a short time of period, so they have to engage with this kind of language and, ethics, scientific ethics. And I think that will bring a lot for the climate reporting, in a sense that for me, the best climate reporting done so far are the ones where, deep in science reading and interviewing science and trying to bring the complexity of the issue to the audiences. And I think that we're going to have a much more, a bigger group of prepared people to deal with the science of climate change right now. That's my hope.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's gonna help a lot in that aspect. I mean, we all know more than we ever wanted to know about how vaccines work, right? Because we've been reading that voraciously over the last couple of days, and soon we'll all know more a lot about how some of these climate solutions are working.
Zoonosis was a big story. I don't know, maybe.
Yeah.
For Imelda, pretty sure it was a big story as well. Zoonosis, right in the beginning of the pandemic, we all jump into like, what's the relation between forest deforestation and COVID? Tell us.
Exactly.
And wildlife trafficking.
Wildlife trafficking.
Right. Yeah. Would you talk about some of your stories that you did early in the pandemic about that?
Yeah, you want to start, Imelda, and then I can tell.
Yeah, we've done a lot of stories on wildlife trafficking and COVID-19 discussions, and of course on climate change. So we have published a series of stories on that, as well as it's in the Philippines. It's still in the relationship of disaster and climate change.
Me, well, just in the right in the beginning of the pandemic, I was lucky to be in touch with David Quammen, and so I did an interview, which was a great start of the coverage. I don't know if everybody knows David Quammen. It's a great National Geographic writer. Not just National Geographic, he's a writer with many books published, and one of his books is called Spillover, which look at the case of Ebola and many other cases of virus that were coming out of wildlife. So I interviewed him, and from this interview already, we started doing a coverage in InfoAmazonia, speaking on different aspects. So my colleague, the editor of InfoAmazonia, Juliana Mori, she did a great work on creating a monitor of COVID in the Amazon, and how these were affecting the indigenous people of the Amazon, and those were great stories with maps showing the distance of the hospital facilities of indigenous territories. That was a nice way of visualizing the difficulties, and then automated updates on deaths and cases in the Amazon region states. And so that was the work we did, some data trying to monitor. And just one more thing that I'm really proud of, one colleague, a friend actually, reached out. He's an anthropologist from the university, and offered a partnership for indigenous people to tell their view and their stories, really personal stories during the pandemic. So there were a lot of touching stories about the meaning of this virus in indigenous cultures, and how that was affecting, cultural aspects of their social and cultural organization. So it was really interesting to have like 15 reports with 15 personal stories in InfoAmazonia about this moment for the indigenous peoples.
Yeah, we started Callaway Climate Insights in the second week of March, literally the week that the lockdowns began. And I remember we had a whole list of stories that we're going to publish in the inaugural issue. And I remember thinking, we should probably have something about COVID, because it might be around for a few weeks or a month. And, we should nod to the fact that this is the global story right now. And little did I know, over the next several weeks, that was pretty much all we were writing about, was COVID and climate change and COVID, the deforestation, the wildlife trafficking, the dramatic decline in pollution above China and many industrial cities in Eastern Europe and in South America, caused by everybody staying at home and sheltering in place. It was a fabulous story, and the two remain intertwined as twin threats. And frankly, from a financial and economic perspective, one of the big stories of the next year is going to be the global recovery from COVID, and whether it is actually a green recovery, given some of the cost dynamics that are going to be in place and fought about at the various government levels.
Right. And a moment ago, a couple of minutes ago, one of you mentioned the idea of making the connection for audiences and communities that this is happening now, as opposed to this is something way off into the future. And I'm wondering how you guys think journalists can do that better. Because they're like, yeah, Imelda, you're smiling.
Yeah. The good news is that we are seeing more and more journalists wanting to learn the ropes of writing climate-related stories, adding, of course, innovative tools such as mobile reporting, use of drones, mapping, infographics, and simulations in their reporting. We have established in the Philippines the Philippine Network of Environmental Journalists in 2010. Now we have more or less 300 members. If I may, for the past few years, and Gustavo knows this very well because he started data journalism, geojournalism in the Internews Earth Journalism Network. It's an international media development organization. We have been conducting training for journalists in the developing countries. Now already more than 10,000 since 2004, I think, to cover widely variety of issues, helps develop innovative online environmental news sites, and we produce content of local media, including groundbreaking investigative reports. As Gustavo, the Earth Journalism Network also helps establish networks of environmental journalists in countries where they don't exist and build their capacity where they do. So we do this through workshops and the development of training materials, and by offering fellowship programs, grants to media organizations, sorry about that, story stipends, and support for story production and distribution. So I think we're doing a lot better now compared to coverage before.
Oh, that's
Yeah, I think it's really the specialty that Gustavo has developed is the specialty that journalists are going to need going forward to really cover the climate threat, and that is data specialty. There's almost too much data, and at the same time, not enough data. The types of data that people might want to see, which are who are the big polluters, how are their footprints changing on a regular basis, needs to be reported on in a much more robust way, along with the vast reams of scientific data. And so the journalists, I think, I'm hand to Gustavo now, who can work with data and work with AI, really are going to be at the forefront of climate reporting in the next couple of years, which really are the most important years. We're hitting a tipping point where there's going to be no going back if we haven't already hit it.
So that's a great point about the data. I'm wondering, how do we make the data real for people in the moment so they realize that has to happen now, that change has to happen?
You mentioned, Jennifer, I think the issue of connection, and I truly think this is the main challenge for us journalists, because things are connected. Like when David was saying, like deforestation affect all of us. Okay, he understands that. Probably he read and learned by doing stories, but not everybody knows that this is real. that the connection is real, and climate is about that. Or it's just one planet connected by one climate that cannot be broken, right? And so I think that explaining the connection goes that way of using a lot of visuals, because it's explaining the science of, for example, how cutting trees in the Amazon reduce rainfall in the producing areas of soybeans of Brazil. This is a concrete thing. It's happening. And we're not even talking about climate per se. I mean, it's microclimate in a sense, regional climate, that if you cut trees in one region, you reduce moisture, and then there's no rain for producing soy. So this is already a discussion that I think it's very instrumental in a sense in Brazil that is happening, because people are seeing this, you know, like maybe droughts that can be already related by science to some of those environmental degradation. And I think the same thing will happen with climate. If the science of attribution, which is attributing, you know, some climate issues, climate change attribution of disasters like the ones Melda were saying, I think people will really connect that something needs to be done. So explaining this connection with a lot of science and data is definitely the way forward.
Yeah, and using that data to show people how it affects them. When you think about, you know, if we could cut all of our global emissions, say, you know, every fossil fuel car stops tomorrow and nobody's flying, and you know, we cut all those global, you know, 50%, right? There's still too much carbon in the atmosphere. It needs to be reduced. What reduces it? Trees. Where's the biggest reduction? Carbon sink, as they say, the Amazon, and the Amazon's burning. You know, people need to understand what exactly the Amazon burning means to them. And if you live in the Southwest or the Southeast of the United States, it might mean that you're going to have to move in the next 15 years. And people, you know, I don't think they quite get that connection. And journalists need, I think Gustavo was right, visuals and data to support that connection and really drive home what's at stake for people.
I want to maybe bring a question following this idea, David. I think on the political aspect of this issue, the politicians of various colors, so to speak, I mean, like various flags and ideologies, they understand this issue very well. That's why I think we're seeing this tension, international tension, when the president of Brazil, for example, says that he doesn't want interference, because I think he understood that the world is concerned about that. So it's a very, again, instrumental discourse, say like, no, this is ours. We take care, because I think it's already in a sphere that it's not about one nation is the owner of this. It's a global balance. That's, as David was saying, the global balance of carbon. Should we collaborate? Should we go back to the Paris Agreement? I think this is the discussion right now. There's no way of doing this alone. No walls are going to stop climate change.
Absolutely. So if you are thinking about coverage in general, like, what do you think is needed in terms of, like, what are the barriers to getting more coverage and making sure that there's really high quality coverage that is reaching people? And then what do you think, I guess, what are the areas also where we think that we need new solutions or new technology to help with that, or new innovations? It doesn't even have to be technology.
Well, I think, you know, the coverage is going to come as the story becomes bigger. The bigger the story is, Biden has been spending this week talking to world leaders. The only thing they're talking about is climate change. As that story becomes more and more prevalent, as it's on the front page of every newspaper and website and television screen, journalists are going to want to cover it. Journalists kind of tend to follow the big story, and they're going to want to cover it. And so we're going to see that. But, you know, barriers to coverage, obviously, like I said, understanding data, understanding things like AI and how that works, understanding what is real and what is hype. there's a, this is new to me as I've been covering this, but there's a lot of hype out there on stuff that's not going to happen, on solutions that aren't going to be, financially or scientifically successful. And journalists, like they always have to do, need to be skeptical and check the facts. And so there's a lot going on. But in terms of innovations, I think innovations like they're doing with in the Amazon, with the Amazon mapping and using data and stuff, really will help journalists explain that type of thing. Innovations in all sorts of other industries that move the climate solution story forward, journalists will be able to adapt those, and that will help them cover them.
Should I bring a point? Yeah, I think in terms of coverage, there's what I see, there will be opportunities. Like the opportunities that are, for example, now on the weather forecast. I should mention, for example, here in Brazil, the Global, which is the biggest TV network of South America, if not Latin America, they're doing great work, we should say. Like just bringing issues to the weather forecast sometimes, and mixing up with in-depth reporting, for example, about the huge fires that we have in Pantanal. You might have seen like this different biome of Brazil, which was burning for months non-stop, worst drought ever recorded, since I don't know what. And so the coverage was really focused on science, climate change, and giving voice to some scientists that are already having evidence and can attribute this phenomenon to climate change, because this is always the issue. The scientists will be very conservative in a sense, say like, well, I can't say this is climate change. But as there's evidence, more and more evidence, you start finding journalists that are talking. So there's opportunities of bringing this, again, science to a trivial thing. It was like a weather report. That's one thing that I would like to mention as an example of like, as again, David was saying, there's opportunities that might come with, I don't know, sport reporting. Who knows? An event that cannot happen because of climate change, or any reporting is an opportunity as long as the event asks for this kind of information. But the other opportunities in terms of innovation I would like to mention, we see, again, a lot of AI happening in journalism. So the elections, a lot of outlets were producing stories with AI, automated stories about the results. This happened in the election for mayors here. And so this kind of alerts, stories as alerts, automated alerts, are already happening in various fields, and it's considered journalism. Like you receive a SMS with a short story that is generated by a robot. So this kind of service, in a sense of distributing information about maybe you should leave your home in the next 4 hours, otherwise it's going to be flooded, can be provided by journalists, as weather forecasts were provided by journalists, or like fire forecasts will be provided by journalists with some kind of level of editorial management behind. And that's the interesting thing. You edit the robots. I think that's the real innovation. Like, I want this robot to give information every hour about this with this specific editorial cut. And that, I think it's a very good way of dealing with some of the issues, because a lot of this data can be automated, like forest fire alerts, other kinds of alerts like flooding alerts, weather alerts, like don't go out, as civil defense actually does already, So, but I see some of this information can be automated and distributed by journalism outlets. That's what I see. Yeah, and Imelda does this, actually. Sorry, Imelda has done this with SMS, right? Yeah.
Imelda? I was just going to say, we here in California, we all became adept at checking the alerts on air quality this summer during the wildfires, right? And all became experts on air quality. And for a few weeks there, we had the worst air in the world, worse than Beijing, worse than New Delhi, and everybody knew it. And that was because of the alerts. It wasn't because of anything else. And it helped educate the people on that. And just lastly, Gustavo, to your sports analogy, I did a story recently. There have been more American football games canceled in the last 2 years because of hurricanes and storms than ever before. And it's a direct impact on climate change. Also, the whole, we didn't really get into the whole racial and minority discussion and poor communities and how they're impacted worse by climate change. But that is a big story in America that's being adapted by professional athletes, basketball players in particular, who are speaking out in the Black Lives Matter movement on that aspect. So it's touching everything.
Yeah, and that's been true around the world. And yeah, it resonates so strongly in the US right now. And we're seeing that for the first time. I think that anyone of that level in terms of public persona coming out and talking about that. Sorry, Imelda, did you want to say?
No, I just want to say that in terms of barriers, I think it's still strengthening the capacity or the skill of journalists in understanding climate change issues. Because if you yourself cannot understand the issue, and then how about your audience? So I think it's the space in terms of space in the newspapers or in the broadcast or radio space. Still, for now, it's being dominated by politics or show business issues. So, and one thing is the resources for journalists to cover those issues on the ground.
True. You muted.
So sorry, yep, I did for just a sec. So yeah, I wanted to talk, Dave started to talk about this a little bit earlier about, as you look ahead to 2021, what are the stories that you think reporters should be ready to cover? And I'm guessing, you've talked about COVID a little bit, I'm guessing that will continue to be a piece of it connected to climate change, but just wanted to find out what you think the big stories will be and what will you be looking for?
Well, obviously I said the COVID recovery story and whether it is indeed a green recovery, whether you're in Latin America or Europe or Asia or the US, how these economies are recreate themselves and reinvent themselves. And if they take the opportunity to do it in a green way, some will, some won't. Globally, we largely missed that opportunity 10 years ago during the great financial crisis. And I think we learned a lesson, and I think there'll be much more of a green recovery. But the other story, I think is, at least in the US, essentially the arms race between the US and China to reduce emissions, both with Biden now in charge in the US, kind of, and Xi Jinping in China pledging to reduce emissions to 2050, maybe. Between the two of them, they represent something like 42% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. So if they actually could find ways to cooperate or at least compete, that is a massive story and something that's going to play out well in 2021. For my readers, it's again the whole ESG, environmental social government movement that's coming up. And then the final one I would say is I referenced it earlier, is it's not enough that the world cuts its emissions. We have to find technologies that pull carbon from the atmosphere. They are there, but not in great scale. And that, I think, you're going to start to see that become much more and more of an important subject of discussion in the media next year.
Thank you, that's great. Imelda?
So with the growing trend of more destructive climate-related disasters, at least in my country, I think some of the stories that we are going to watch out for are, first is the displacement. As a low-lying island nation dominated by coastal communities, it is susceptible to tsunamis, sea level rise, and storm surges. Number two is the call for climate emergency. Environmental groups will continue to call for the establishment of a scientific and human rights body to lead the implementation of a climate emergency action plan in the country. Another thing is the coal moratorium in the Philippines. Just last month, the Philippine government declared a moratorium on new coal-fired power plants in the Philippines. There are already around like 28, I think, coal-fired power plants currently operating throughout the country. And well, will the country transition away from fossil fuels and move towards renewable energy? Or is it a strong signal to call investors as well as financial institutions that fossil fuels are losing proportions? That we have to find out. Biodiversity, of course, will continue to be a key coverage area. Biodiversity loss and ecosystems destruction. Strengthening, of course, public infrastructure, declining farm yields, and health issues traced to extreme weather events. Also put climate change in the news. Plastic pollution, water management, poverty, and economic crisis. And of course, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic to the environment.
In my opinion, I will focus on the following the idea that I think the Biden presidency will change a lot of the discussion, not the least the solutions will to be seen, but the discussion in terms of like what is the expectations to the meeting of Glasgow, for example, which is the next UN summit that was canceled this year. I think it will take another level in importance. It's going to become a story because an agreement can come out of this, of solutions, and forests, which is my main area, it's definitely going to be part of the discussion. So I think it's going to be a big story for us covering forests, what's going to be the role of forests on the climate solution. And that's going to bring a lot of tensions. So relating with a lot of what Imelda was saying and David about the social problems that are coming with this climate crisis, you know, like issues of adaptation, the most vulnerable, and related, of course, with the recovery or the length of this recovery, who's going to suffer more. I think we will see in this part of the world, in South America, a big story about the tensions that connect the destruction of forests and a lot of illegality. That's becoming a big story in terms of like all the gold mining that's happening right now in the Amazon. Is a very tense situation of actual security, in a sense that you have areas of the Amazon dominated by criminal gangs. It might look like a small issue related to climate, but it means like, okay, that you have a global agreement, but you have like this outlaw people out in the jungle, just destroying the jungle. Who's going to deal with them? You know, because we're talking about like dissident Colombian guerrilla supported by communists, you know, governments, and you know, having some very big political tension in the frontiers of Venezuela and Brazil, which definitely interests to the US, I think will come into play. And that's going to be part of the story. It's more of a guess of something that we can see in the news in 2021.
That's really good point. And I think I should have mentioned, but Imelda did, the coal situation globally, essentially the death of the coal industry, how quickly that might happen with some countries in Asia and Eastern Europe still relying on it, others not, you know, the fact that renewables are cheaper now than fossil fuels. How that plays out is going to happen pretty quickly in the next couple of years. It'll be a big story next year.
Wow, that's a lot to cover for reporters this coming year. We have a question, and it's about can President Biden stop the drilling in Alaska once he is president? And that goes to a bigger question of what can Biden do, because he wants to rejoin Paris and he can make a lot of changes in certain areas. But Dave, you had a very interesting column or post about this recently, about what, you know, cooperation.
Yeah, in the column, I was essentially arguing that, Biden can do a lot to undo some of Trump's more damaging regulations. He can issue a lot of executive orders. But if he really wants to make progress, if he really wants, to have I said the next couple of years are key for the world. If this Biden presidency, if he can gain the type of cooperation internationally, but also in Washington, that would allow him to make progress, I think, it could be a historic couple of years. And there are a lot of Republicans who favor climate change solutions and, who have basically been keeping their mouths shut. And so I think there was a lot of opportunity, I was saying, in that. But, as for things like Anwar, the drilling, the wildlife refuge in Alaska, that's almost a bit of a sideshow to begin with. There's no drilling now. Trump is trying to rush through the leases so he can have them sold by the inauguration. Biden can easily stop them once that happens. And frankly, from the time you get the lease to the time you stick a drill in the ground is usually several years. It's very expensive to drill up in Alaska. I'm not even sure it's worth it to the oil companies that would buy the leases now to want to dig in 6 or 7 years. So, that story, like the Keystone Pipeline in the US, has a long way to go, I think.
That makes sense. So we're close to needing to wrap up, but if anyone has anything else they'd like to add, there's still time.
I'd like to ask Imelda a question. I'm fascinated by what's going on over in Asia. And, as you look out across the geopolitical spectrum there, what do you think, the most troublesome countries will be in the world's impact, goal to fight climate change?
Well, it's still, for me, I think it's still the developing countries, of course, the low-lying nations like the Philippines or small islands or atoll in the Pacific region were mostly affected by sea level rise, of course, droughts, food shortage, and the like, and of course the disasters that's coming along the way. So I think these countries are the most vulnerable ones, of course.
But in terms of the biggest polluters, China, obviously, Japan to some extent, I guess.
Yes.
Is that going to continue to be an issue, especially for the low-lying countries?
Yeah, of course. We're looking, well, China, of course, and India, and we're looking under Biden. We're looking that we will have more predictable, more deliberate U.S. government, a better partner internationally in most things like climate change issues, looking at these vulnerable countries. And I think we need the U.S. to take a lead on climate change at the global level and to take it seriously. So we hope Biden administration to join or to rejoin the Paris Agreement on climate change to address all these concerns.
Thank you,
Jennifer, you're muted again.
Sorry, I had to cough and drink water for a second, so I muted myself. Sorry about that. So did anyone want to add anything before we wrap up?
Well, I just want to say that this kind of gatherings are wonderful. I think it's great to exchange ideas and among us journalists, and probably helping some of our audience of journalists. And I don't know, I think we should keep connected, or all participants doing some of this collaborative stories. I really am seeing a lot of potential of journalists working together in different issues, from human rights to, like energy, sustainable energy. So here's my thank you for you.
Well, thank you. I definitely agree about collaboration. Sorry, Imelda.
No, I'm just saying that we should, of course, humanize climate in human interaction if we want to, if we want the world's attention. And another thing is that sometimes people avoid news negativity or the doom and gloom scenario. This is true solutions journalism, of course. So I think Dave mentioned this already. Rather than reinforce this news fatigue, solutions journalism focuses on shifting the balance by promoting forward-looking or rigorous coverage of responses to social problems such as climate change. So I think we need to do more solutions journalism and impact stories.
Yeah, more connectivity like this. I agree with both of you. And ICFJ is the place to do it, obviously. And I mean, I just can't get enough of the Amazon story. And I think it's just going to become bigger and bigger and bigger for the whole world. So look forward to seeing what everyone can do on it. Gustavo, good luck.
Yeah. Oh, great work. Let us know of the connections, how you can connect.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all three of you so much for participating tonight. This has been incredibly interesting and your insights are really helpful. And I think there are a lot of great ideas to follow up on for all of us who've listened tonight and or this morning for our friend Imelda. Thank you all who have tuned in to this discussion, and we hope everyone stays safe and keeps reporting on climate change, and be sure to share your stories in the ICFJ Global Health Crisis Forum. Thank you all for joining us. Good night.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Take
Bye.
care.